The pale morning came into Kessler Station the way exhausted things arrive everywhere. Slowly. Quietly. Without any of the confidence that a ship is supposed to project when it enters a port. Its running lights were dim, one of them flickering in an irregular pattern that suggested the power systems were doing their best, and their best was not particularly impressive right now. The hull was scarred in places, not from weapons, just from hard travel, from pushing through sectors that a ship in better condition would have taken a safer route around. It drifted into the outer docking ring and stopped, waiting the way something waits when it has run out of options and is hoping the universe will provide one. Inside the station, the argument started almost immediately. Kessler Station was a mid-lane port, the kind of place that existed primarily to service ships passing through rather than to be a destination in itself. It was practical and busy and run by people who had learned over many years that the fastest way to keep things running smoothly was to avoid complications. Complications cost money. Complications created paperwork. Complications occasionally created the kind of attention that a neutral port did not want from the various military and political powers moving through the lanes. The pale morning was a complication. The docking authority could see the manifest from the moment the ship made contact. 43 Vori passengers. Children, all of them under the age of what passed for 12 Vori years. One registered guardian. Origin point listed as Colony 7, which anyone who had been following the news in this sector for the past 8 months would recognize as a colony that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. 43 children from a colony that had been destroyed in a war that was technically, officially, still ongoing, being shepherded into a neutral port by a single guardian on a ship running on backup power. The docking authority denied them a berth inside 4 minutes. The explanation, delivered over comms in the flat professional tone of someone who has learned to deliver bad news without sounding like they feel bad about it, was that the station was operating at capacity. This was not entirely untrue. There were empty berths, but there were also rules about which ships could use them, and the pale morning did not meet the current requirements for civilian docking due to its registration status and several outstanding flags on its travel record that would need to be cleared through the proper channels before any berthing could be approved. The proper channels, everyone understood without it being said, would take weeks. Possibly longer. Inside the pale morning, in the main cabin that had been converted into a sleeping area for 43 children who were currently either asleep or pretending to be, Sarah stood at the comm panel and listened to the explanation without moving. She was tall enough that she had to angle her head slightly to avoid the overhead fixtures, something she had been doing automatically for the past 6 days without thinking about it. 7 feet and a few inches, broad across the shoulders, with the particular stillness of someone who has trained for so long that even their resting state looks deliberate. She had not slept in 6 days. This was not an exaggeration. She had tried twice for short periods, and both times something had pulled her back. A sound from one of the children, a shift in the ship's engine tone, once just a feeling she couldn't name that said not yet. So she had stayed awake and kept moving and done the next thing and then the next thing after that, which was how she had operated her entire career and which she understood was not sustainable indefinitely, but which had gotten 43 children from a burning colony to a station that was now telling her there was no room. She asked, calmly, if there were any exceptions to the current berthing policy for vessels carrying minors. The docking authority said it would need to look into that and would get back to her. Sarah looked at the comm panel for a moment after the channel clicked to hold. Then she turned and walked to the small viewport at the side of the cabin and looked out at the station's outer ring, at the other ships berthed in the bays, at the lights of the port moving in their normal rhythms, completely unbothered by the pale morning sitting in the outer approach with nowhere to go. She was angry. This was not new. She had been angry for 8 days, since before the colony, since the first signs that what was coming could not be stopped and that the only possible response was to get the children out. The anger had become a kind of fuel source, not the hot variety that makes people loud and reckless, but the cold, steady variety that simply keeps you functional when everything reasonable has run out. She was running on it now the way the pale morning was running on backup power. Technically sufficient. Not designed for extended use. 2 bays over, a hauler called the Margin Call was in the middle of a standard refueling stop. It was not a large ship. Independent class, the kind of vessel that moves goods and occasional passengers through the mid and outer lanes, owned and operated rather than corporate flagged, which meant it answered to its captain and its captain answered to no one in particular. It was clean and well maintained and had the look of something that had been kept functional through consistent attention rather than money. The crew were 6 people who had been working together long enough to move around each other without needing to talk much. Their captain was Linda Marsh. She was at the refueling station's small service window when the argument between the pale morning and the docking authority came over the open comms channel. Ports kept certain communications on open broadcast as standard practice, partly for transparency and partly because traffic management was easier when everyone could hear what was happening. Linda had a cup of coffee in her hand and a refueling estimate on the screen in front of her, and she was not particularly looking for anything to add to her day. She listened to the docking authority's explanation. She listened to Sarah's response. She listened to the hold music that followed, which was a generic station tone that played on loop and that she had heard in various ports across the lanes more times than she could count. She set down her coffee. She pulled up the docking interface on her own panel, the one that controlled the margin call's external connections, and she filed a coupling request for the Pale Morning. Ship-to-ship docking, her hull to theirs, which was legal under mid-lane maritime protocol as long as the initiating vessel's captain accepted liability for the connected ship during the coupling period. Linda accepted liability. Then she opened the margin call's cargo manifest and added 43 entries under the supplementary passenger category, listing them as crew-adjacent civilians under her ship's registration. It was a stretch of the category's intended use. It was not technically incorrect. Then she opened a channel to the docking authority and told them, in the same flat professional tone they had used with the Pale Morning, that the vessel in the outer approach was now registered as a secondary attachment to the margin call and that its passengers were listed under her manifest and that if there were any concerns about the arrangement they were welcome to file a formal inquiry which she would respond to through the proper channels. She said proper channels the way someone says something they know the other person understands completely. The docking authority said it would note the arrangement and review it in due course. Linda said that sounded fine and closed the channel. The whole thing had taken 11 minutes. Across the coupling connection in the Pale Morning's main cabin, Sarah felt the ship move slightly as the docking clamps engaged. She looked at the viewport. She could see the hull of the margin call now, close enough to make out the individual plates of its exterior, the careful repairs along one section of the lower hull, the small running lights steady and even in a way that her own ships no longer were. She did not fully understand what had just happened. She understood the mechanics of it. She could read the coupling notification on her panel and see the manifest update come through and follow the logic of what the other captain had done. What she did not understand was why. There was no obvious benefit to the margin call in this arrangement. There was only liability accepted and paperwork filed and a stranger's ship attached to her hull. Something moved through Sarah's chest. Not the anger. Something else, underneath it, quieter. She recognized it distantly the way you recognize a sound you haven't heard in a long time, something from before, something that belonged to a period when things were different. She didn't have a clean word for it. She stood at the viewport and looked at the hull of the margin call and she thought about what it meant when a person who had no reason to act decided to act anyway, quickly and without announcement, and then filed the paperwork to make it real. Outside, Kessler Station continued its normal operations. Ships came and went. The docking authority moved on to the next item on its list. And two vessels sat coupled in the outer ring, one of them full of children who were finally, for the first time in days, in a situation that was not actively getting worse. That was enough for now. For now it was enough. The transfer took about 2 hours. Moving 43 children from one ship to another through a coupling corridor is not a fast process under any circumstances. Moving 43 children who were tired and frightened and operating in an unfamiliar environment, through a narrow corridor, into a ship they had never seen, overseen by beings most of them had never encountered before, was significantly slower. There were stops. There were children who needed to be carried. There were two who refused to move at all for a period of about 20 minutes and had to be talked through it patiently in the quiet particular way that Sarah had developed over the past week, crouching down to their level, speaking low and steady until whatever had locked up inside them loosened enough to allow forward movement. Linda's crew stood at the far end of the corridor and waited. They did not rush. They did not make the kind of well-meaning noise that adults sometimes make around frightened children that ends up making things worse. They just waited, which Sarah noted and appreciated without saying anything about it. When the last child came through and the corridor was clear, Linda did a quick head count. Got to 43, nodded once to herself, and turned to look at the ship behind her with the expression of someone who has just accepted a problem and is now deciding where to start with it. The margin call was a good ship. Functional, honest, well-kept. It was also, very clearly, not designed with 43 small passengers in mind. The main cargo area was the largest open space available and it was full of cargo. The crew quarters were 6 small rooms built for 6 specific people. The common area was a decent size but not large. The galley could prepare food for 8 comfortably and would need to be creative beyond that. Linda walked through the ship for about 15 minutes after the children arrived. She moved at a steady pace, not rushing, just looking at things, touching a wall here, opening a door there, doing a kind of quiet inventory of what was available and what could be shifted. Sarah followed at a distance, watching. Then Linda went and found her crew and had a short conversation. Sarah couldn't hear the details from where she stood, but she could see the shape of it. Linda talked. The crew listened. There was one question from the tall one, the engineer whose name Sarah hadn't caught yet. Linda answered it. The crew nodded and split off in different directions, and the reorganization began. It did not happen according to a plan exactly. It happened the way practical things happen when practical people are involved, one problem at a time, in whatever order the problems presented themselves. The cargo in the main hold got consolidated and stacked to one side, creating a large open sleeping area. Bedding came from the crew quarters, supplemented by cargo padding that was clean and thick enough to be comfortable. The temperature in that section of the ship was adjusted. Lighting was dimmed to the lower end of the spectrum, which the Vori, Sarah knew, found more comfortable than the brighter white light humans tended to prefer. Linda found this out by asking Sarah directly, standing in the middle of the hold with a technical panel in her hand, looking at the lighting controls. Not assuming. Asking. Sarah told her. Linda adjusted the settings. Done. By the time 4 hours had passed, the ship looked and felt genuinely different. Not perfect. Not a purpose-built facility. But workable in the specific way that a place becomes workable when someone has paid actual attention to the details that matter and fixed them in order. The children settled. Not completely, not the deep settled of genuine security, but the provisional settled of exhaustion overcoming anxiety, which was enough for now. They found corners and spots and small arrangements that suited them, the way children do when given a space and permission to figure it out themselves. The sounds of the ship changed. Less tense. Quieter in the specific way of a place where people are starting to breathe normally again. Sarah did not sleep. This was day 7 without it now. She had stopped counting in terms of what was reasonable and was simply operating, which was the only mode available to her. She moved through the ship, checking on the children in rotation, making sure the ones who needed something had it, making sure the ones who were struggling were not struggling alone. This was her function. She was clear on her function. She had been clear on it for the entirety of the past week, and the clarity of it was part of what had kept her standing. Linda came and found her at some point past midnight, in the corridor outside the sleeping area. She had a mug of something warm in each hand, and she held one out to Sarah without preamble. Sarah looked at it. "It's just tea," Linda said. "Nothing complicated." Sarah took it. The mug was slightly too small for her hands, but she held it carefully. They stood in the corridor for a moment without talking. From inside the sleeping area came the quiet sounds of 43 children in various stages of sleep. Small noises. Shifting. The occasional murmur. Nothing alarming. "How many of them do you know by name?" Sarah asked. It came out less like a question and more like something she was thinking out loud. "All of them," Linda said. Sarah looked at her. "I asked them when they came aboard," Linda said, as if this were obvious. Seemed important to know. Sarah turned this over for a moment. She had 43 names memorized herself, had memorized them in the first hours of the evacuation because knowing their names was part of keeping them real, part of the commitment she had made when she took them out of that colony. But she had been their guardian. She had a specific reason. Linda had learned them because it had seemed important. No other reason. They finished their tea and Linda went back toward the front of the ship and Sarah went back to her rotation. At 2 in the morning, a child named Ori, the youngest of the group by a considerable margin, started crying in the way that children cry when they are cold and half asleep and don't fully understand why they feel bad. Sarah was moving toward her before the sound had fully registered consciously. She was almost at the doorway when she saw Linda already inside, kneeling next to the heating unit on the far wall with a tool in her hand, working quietly and efficiently in the low light, not waking anyone else, fixing the problem at its source. Sarah stopped in the doorway. Linda got the unit working, checked the temperature reading, satisfied herself that it was climbing, and put one hand briefly and lightly on Ori's back without waking her. Then she stood up, tucked the tool back into her pocket and walked back toward the door. She noticed Sarah standing there. Neither of them said anything. Linda gave a small nod of the kind that means it's handled and moved past her back down the corridor. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment. The heating unit hummed steadily. Ori had stopped crying. The room was warm. She went back to her rotation. Breakfast the next morning was a production. The galley was not built for this volume and Linda's crew had clearly been thinking about the problem because they had set up a secondary station in the common area, simple food, things that required no explanation to eat, laid out where the children could reach it without needing to ask anyone for anything. That detail, Sarah noticed, The deliberate decision to make the food accessible rather than served, to give the children autonomy over a small thing so that not everything in their day required them to depend on a stranger. She noticed it and filed it away with the other things she had been filing. The children ate. They were still quiet, still cautious, but hunger is a strong motivator, and eventually most of them made their way through the line. 3 of the older ones had started making very tentative attempts at communication with Linda's crew, the careful exploratory kind of interaction that children attempt when they are curious but not yet sure it's safe to be curious. Linda was sitting at the end of the common area table with a cup of coffee when it happened. 3 of the children, none of them older than what would be 8 in human years, drifted toward her in the gradual sideways way of children who want something but haven't committed to wanting it yet. They circled. They got closer. And then, in the way of Vori children who have decided that a person is safe, all 3 of them climbed onto her at once. This was a thing Vori children did. Sarah knew it well. It was instinctive, a contact behavior that meant trust, meant safety, meant this one is ours now in the particular possessive way that children claim people they have decided are good. It was also, from the outside, quite sudden if you were not expecting it. Linda looked surprised. That was fair. It was surprising. She looked down at the 3 small gray-skinned children arranged on and around her with the expression of someone rapidly processing an unexpected situation and deciding how to respond to it. She went very still, set her coffee down carefully, and simply sat there, solid and unbothered, while the 3 of them settled. From across the room Sarah watched this. She watched Linda look down at the children once with an expression that was not performance, not the performed warmth that people sometimes put on when they want to appear good with children. It was just genuine. Simple. She looked at them the way you look at something that is exactly where it is supposed to be. Sarah had spent the entirety of her adult life around people who were afraid of her. Not always openly. Sometimes it was subtle, the way someone positioned themselves slightly away from her in a room, the way conversations became more formal, more careful, more aware of what she was and what she represented. She had made her peace with it a long time ago. It was simply a fact of what she was and how she moved through the world. Linda Marsh was not afraid of her. This had been clear from the first moment on the coupling corridor, and it had remained clear through every interaction since. She spoke to Sarah directly and waited for direct answers, and when she got them she moved on. She did not soften herself or harden herself or adjust her approach based on what Sarah looked like or what Sarah carried or what Sarah might be capable of. She treated her, Sarah realized, the way you treat someone you've simply decided is a person. This should not have been as remarkable as it was. Sarah was aware of that. And yet, she found herself later that afternoon standing in the corridor outside the common room long after Linda had moved on to the next thing, looking at the empty doorway, holding her empty mug. She was a guardian. She was trained. She was precise and experienced and had spent her entire career knowing exactly where her attention should be and why. She told herself she was observing professionally, assessing the situation, the crew, the environment. Standard practice. She stood there for a while longer. It was not entirely convincing. The first 2 days out from Kessler Station were quiet in the way that things are quiet when everyone is too tired to be loud. The children settled into the rhythms of the ship slowly, the way water finds its level, adjusting to the sounds and the spaces and the particular personalities of the crew around them. Linda's people were good at giving them room without ignoring them, which is harder than it sounds. Too much attention from strangers is overwhelming. Too little feels like abandonment. The crew had found the middle ground without being told to find it, which told Sarah something about the kind of captain Linda was and the kind of crew that kind of captain tends to build around herself. Sarah moved through her days on the margin call the same way she had moved through everything for the past week. Function to function, child to child, problem to problem. She slept in short intervals now, an hour here, 90 minutes there, which was not enough but was more than nothing, and her body had accepted the compromise without too much complaint. She ate when she remembered to. She kept her attention distributed across 43 points of responsibility and checked each one regularly, and this was enough to fill every hour she had. She did not think about Linda. She thought about Linda occasionally and told herself she was not thinking about her, which amounted to the same thing. On the morning of day 3 she was in the secondary sleeping area helping one of the older children work through a breathing exercise, a technique Sarah had learned years ago and had been quietly teaching to the ones who woke from bad dreams, when she heard the tone from the bridge that meant the scanner had flagged something worth attention. It was a specific tone. Not the general proximity alert that fired whenever another vessel came within range. This was the military class designation, a different sound, lower, with a pulse to it, the kind of alert that ships in the outer lanes learn to take seriously. Sarah was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. She settled the child with a word and a hand on the shoulder, the particular gesture she used that meant stay here and be calm, and moved toward the bridge. Linda was already at the scanner when Sarah arrived. Two of the crew were behind her, looking at the same display. The image was clear. One vessel, large, military configuration, drive signature consistent with Horan Collective Fleet class. Running at approach speed, not passing through, coming toward them with the specific directional purpose of something that knows where it's going and has decided to go there. The Horan Collective. Sarah looked at the display and felt the cold version of anger move through her, the one that didn't heat up, the one that just settled in and stayed. She knew that drive signature. She had been looking over her shoulder for it since the colony. Since before the colony, if she was being exact about it. The message came through 4 minutes after the scanner alert. Text only, which was sometimes a deliberate choice, a way of conducting communication that doesn't require you to look at the other party or allow them to look at you. It was short. The margin call was requested to come to a full stop and prepare for boarding. The Vori survivors aboard were wanted for processing under Horan Collective jurisdiction. Compliance would be noted. Non-compliance would result in enforcement action. It did not say please. It did not use the word requested in a way that actually meant request. Linda read it. Her face did not do very much while she read it, which Sarah had started to recognize as a thing Linda's face did when she was thinking seriously. Not blankness. More like everything going inward, processing happening below the surface, the external expression on pause while the internal work finished. She straightened up from the scanner and looked at her crew. Meeting, she said. Common room. 2 minutes. Sarah followed. She stood in the doorway of the common room, which had become her usual position in group settings on this ship, partly because the doorframe was the right height for her to lean against comfortably and partly because the doorway gave her sight lines in 2 directions. Old habit. Linda stood at the head of the table. Her crew settled around it. For people, different in the way that crews tend to be different, the mix of personalities that ends up on independent haulers being generally the kind that doesn't fit neatly elsewhere. They were all looking at Linda with the focused attention of people who have learned that when this particular person calls a meeting it is worth paying attention. She laid it out plainly. One Horan military vessel, significantly better armed than the margin call. Running away was possible but not clean, they had a speed disadvantage and the fuel margin was not comfortable. Fighting was not a real option, she said this without apology or drama, just as information, a variable in the calculation. She had looked at the numbers and the numbers said no. Then she said what she was going to do instead. The crew went quiet. Not the quiet of disagreement. The quiet of people who are hearing something unexpected and are deciding how they feel about it. Sarah, in the doorway, was also quiet for a slightly different reason. She was trying to confirm that she had understood correctly what Linda had just said, because what Linda had just said was that she intended to respond to a military vessel that had just issued an enforcement threat by opening a comm channel and talking to them. Not to negotiate terms of handover. Not to buy time while they ran. To make the legal and procedural reality of the situation so complicated and so clearly documented that the captain of that vessel would make the practical decision that this particular boarding was more trouble than the outcome was worth. You want to fight them with paperwork, said the engineer, whose name Sarah had learned by now was Walt. I want to remind them of agreements they've already made, Linda said. There's a difference. Walt thought about this. Is there? Yes, Linda said. One of them works. She went to the bridge and sat down at the comm panel and opened the channel. What followed was 40 minutes that Sarah would think about for a long time afterward, going over the details, finding new things in them each time. Linda's voice on the comm was the same voice she used for everything else. Not raised, not tight, not performing a confidence she didn't feel. Just her normal voice, which had a quality to it of someone who is saying what they believe to be true and is not particularly concerned about whether the other party finds it convenient. She started by acknowledging the message. She said she had received the boarding request and wanted to respond to it formally and on record, and that she was initiating a recorded channel for that purpose, which meant everything said on both sides from this point forward was being logged by her ship's system. She said this pleasantly, matter-of-factly. Then she began. The first treaty she cited was the Kessler Accord, a mid-lane civilian protection agreement that the Horan Collective had signed 11 years ago along with 14 other governments, which established specific protections for non-combatant minors in transit through neutral or contested space. She read the relevant section. The exact language. Slowly and clearly with the document reference number so that anyone listening could look it up. The Horan captain responded. His tone was flat and somewhat impatient. He said the Vori survivors were persons of interest under an active collective jurisdiction matter and that civilian protection agreements did not supersede active jurisdictional claims. Linda said she understood that position and wanted to address it and then cited the second document, which was the collective's own internal charter, Section 14, Subsection 3, which defined the conditions under which jurisdictional claims could be applied to non-citizen minors in neutral space. She pointed out, specifically and without accusation, just as information, that the conditions outlined in that section had not been met in the current situation because the margin call was operating in a lane designated as neutral under the Port Authority framework established at the Veldier Summit, which the collective had also signed. There was a pause on the other end. She cited the Port Authority protocol while the pause continued. Two of them. She explained how they interacted with each other and with the Kessler Accord in the specific context of the current situation. She said she wanted to make sure the record was complete so that whatever decision was made could be made with full information available. She was not aggressive. She was not emotional. She was the way a wall is. Not threatening, not advancing, just completely and absolutely not moving. The pause on the other end of the channel got longer. Sarah stood in the doorway of the bridge and watched Linda sit at that comm panel with her shoulders level and her voice steady and 300 years of combined legal text apparently memorized well enough to deploy in real time, and she felt something happen in her chest that was not anger and was not relief and was not any of the things she was used to feeling in situations like this. She had spent her career solving problems with her body. With training and strength and the particular effectiveness of being something that other things did not want to fight. She understood that kind of solution completely. She was good at it. She had never watched someone solve a problem like this. With nothing but words and documents and the absolute refusal to be moved, sitting in a chair, completely still, taking apart a military threat one clause at a time. The Horan captain said he would need to consult with command before proceeding. Linda said that sounded reasonable and that she would keep the channel open. 11 minutes later the Horan vessel changed its heading. Away from the margin call, back toward wherever it had come from, moving with the particular speed of something that has decided to be somewhere else and would prefer not to discuss why. Linda closed the channel. She sat for a moment at the panel, not moving, just letting the quiet settle. Then she picked up her coffee, which had gone cold during the 40 minutes, and drank it anyway. Behind her in the doorway Sarah stood very still. She was looking at the back of Linda's head. At the set of her shoulders. At the completely ordinary way she was sitting in that chair after doing something that Sarah's entire framework for how problems got solved did not have a proper category for. The unfamiliar thing moved through her chest again. The one she had first felt at Kessler Station watching a stranger file paperwork for 43 children she had no reason to care about. It was stronger now. More defined. Starting to have edges she could feel clearly. She still didn't have a word for it. But she was starting to think she should find one. The 3 days after the Horan ship turned away were the quietest days the margin call had seen since the children came aboard. Not silent. A ship with 43 children on it is never silent. There was always something, a voice from the sleeping area, footsteps in the corridor, the particular sound of children beginning to feel safe enough to be loud occasionally, which was actually a good sign even when it was inconvenient. But the quality of the noise was different now. Lighter. The sounds of a place where the immediate danger had passed and people were remembering how to exist without their shoulders up around their ears. The crew felt it too. Sarah could see it in the way they moved through the ship. Slightly slower. Less deliberate. Walt had started humming to himself while he worked on things, which apparently he did normally and had stopped doing after the Horan alert without anyone asking him to. Linda's co-pilot, a quiet woman named Deborah who had said approximately 40 words since Sarah came aboard and all of them functional, had started sitting with 2 of the older Vori children in the evenings and teaching them a card game that involved a lot of hand gestures and appeared to have no fixed rules. The children loved it. Sarah watched all of this and kept her rotation and slowly, very slowly, let something in her own posture shift toward something less like readiness and more like rest. She did not stop watching. She would not stop watching, not until the children were somewhere that did not require her to watch. But there is a difference between the watching you do when danger is immediate and the watching you do when it is only possible, and for the first time in over a week she was doing the second kind. It required less of her. It left room for other things. She was not entirely sure what to do with the room. On the 4th evening after the Horan encounter she found herself in the galley at a time she didn't usually use it. Her rotation had shifted slightly to accommodate a change in the children's sleep schedule, 2 of the youngest having decided that the ship's designated night cycle was not their preferred night cycle, and she had ended up with an hour she hadn't planned on. She went to the galley because it was warm and because the ship's motion was easiest to feel in the central sections and she had developed, over days of being on the margin call, a habit of using that subtle movement to settle her thoughts when they got complicated. Linda was already there. She was sitting at the small table against the inner wall, both hands wrapped around a mug, looking out the narrow viewport beside her at the stars moving slowly past. She wasn't doing anything. Not reading, not working, not reviewing anything on a screen. Just sitting and looking at the stars and drinking whatever was in the mug. Sarah had not seen her do nothing before. She was always between things, always moving from one task toward the next with that steady, unhurried efficiency that Sarah had spent days observing. This was different. This was actual stillness. Linda heard her come in and looked over. She didn't seem surprised. She gestured at the seat across from her with a small movement of her head, the kind of invitation that doesn't make a big deal of itself and leaves the other person room to decline without awkwardness. Sarah sat down. She folded herself into the chair carefully, the way she had learned to fold herself into spaces on this ship that were not quite the right size, and she looked at the viewport and the stars moving past it. For a little while neither of them said anything. This did not feel uncomfortable. That was the thing Sarah noticed first. Silence with most people had a texture to it, an expectation, a slight pressure of someone waiting for the quiet to end. This silence didn't have that. It was just two people in a warm room with something to look at, not needing the space between them to be filled. Linda spoke first. She asked about the Vori. Not about the colony or the war or the evacuation, not the part that was recent and raw, but about the culture itself, what they were like, what mattered to them, what their daily life had looked like before everything that had happened. She asked it the way someone asks about something they are genuinely curious about, not making conversation, actually wanting to know. Sarah answered. Slowly at first, choosing words carefully, because she was not accustomed to talking about this kind of thing with someone outside her own people. But Linda listened in a way that made answering feel natural rather than exposing. She didn't interject much. When she did, it was a question that came directly from what Sarah had just said, which meant she had actually heard it rather than just waiting for her turn. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't a small thing. Sarah talked about the Vori the way she had not talked about them in years. Not the strategic information, not the protective brief she had given countless times to transit officials and port authorities, but the actual texture of them. The way their children learned by physical contact, by climbing and touching and being held, which was why the three children had gone to Linda that first morning and why it had meant what it meant. The way they marked the important moments of their lives not with objects but with names, adding a new name to their own each time something significant changed them, so that by the time a Vori elder died they had accumulated a full history of themselves in the sequence of what they chose to be called. The way they sang in the evenings, not performance, just the daily practice of it, the way some people take walks. Linda listened to all of this. At one point she got up and refilled her mug and gestured at Sarah's empty hands with a raised eyebrow, and Sarah nodded and accepted whatever was being offered, which turned out to be tea of some kind, mild and slightly sweet, the kind of thing that is not remarkable in itself but is exactly right for a late evening in a small warm room. When Sarah finished, Linda was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone sitting with what they've just been told rather than rushing past it. Then she said simply that the Vori sounded like people she would have liked to know more of. Sarah looked at her. It was such a direct thing to say. Not a diplomatic response, not a careful expression of sympathy, just an honest statement about what she felt. Sarah had not heard very many honest statements in the past several weeks. There had been a lot of careful language, official language, the kind of words that people use when they are managing a situation rather than responding to it. This was different. This was just true. She asked Linda then, because the conversation had the quality of something that could hold a real question, how a person ended up doing what Linda did. Not the specific career path, not the resume version, but actually, genuinely, how someone ends up captaining an independent hauler in the outer lanes, taking on other people's problems at neutral ports, going to war with paperwork when warships show up. Linda smiled at that last part. Not a big smile. Just a small one at the corner of her mouth, the kind that happens when something lands accurately. She said it was a long story. She said it involved two genuinely bad decisions and one good one, and that the good one was buying the ship and that the bad ones were honestly more interesting as stories, but that was probably a conversation that required a second cup of tea and maybe a later hour. Sarah noted that she had not actually said she wouldn't tell her. She had said not tonight. She noted that this implied a tonight that was not this one. A future conversation. She filed this away carefully. They sat for a while longer. The stars moved past the viewport at the slow, steady rate of a ship at cruising speed, which was meditative in the specific way that things are meditative when they are large and constant and indifferent to whatever small concerns are happening nearby. Sarah found her thoughts settling in a way they hadn't settled in days. Linda talked a little about the ship. About how the margin call worked, not technically but personally, what it meant to her to have it, what it felt like to be the person responsible for it and for the people on it. She talked about responsibility in a way that resonated with Sarah in a place she hadn't expected to feel resonance, because it was the same language underneath even though the specific circumstances were completely different. The understanding that some things are yours to carry and you carry them not because someone is watching but because you decided you would. At some point Linda said she should get a few hours of sleep before the morning watch. She stood up, put her mug in the small sink and paused at the doorway. She said goodnight to Sarah in the quiet direct way she said everything. Sarah said goodnight back. And then Linda was gone and the galley was just Sarah and the sound of the ship and the stars in the viewport, moving slowly past. Sarah sat there for a long time after. She thought about the way Linda had listened. The way she had asked about the Vori like their culture was worth understanding rather than just worth knowing about for practical purposes. The way she had said the bad decisions were more interesting, which was not deflection but an actual promise of a future conversation, offered so naturally that it had almost slipped past without being noticed. She thought about the morning with the heating unit, the meeting that lasted 4 minutes, the 40 minutes on the comm that had ended with a warship deciding to be somewhere else. Sarah was a guardian. She was trained to assess situations, read environments, understand what things were and what they meant. This was her skill, the one she had spent her life developing, the one that had kept 43 children alive through circumstances that should not have been survivable. She knew what she was noticing. She was clear-eyed enough to know that. She was also aware that knowing what you are noticing and knowing what to do about it are two different kinds of knowledge, and that she currently had the first kind and was entirely uncertain about the second. She had spent her whole life knowing what to do. Training gave you that. Experience sharpened it. There was always a next step, a correct action, a response that fit the situation. Even in the worst moments of the past week, even in the moments where the options were all bad and it was just a question of which bad option preserved the most, she had known what to do. This was different territory. Unfamiliar in a way that was not unpleasant but that she had no map for. The strange part was that she did not find herself wanting to leave it. She sat in the galley for a little while longer, her hands around a cooling mug of tea, the stars moving steadily past the viewport, and she let herself simply be in a situation she did not fully understand yet. That was new. She thought she might be all right with new. The Vori safe harbor came into view on the morning of day 9 and Sarah stood at the bridge viewport and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. It was small. That was the first thing. She had not known what to expect exactly but she had carried in her mind, through the entire 9 days, some version of a destination that matched the weight of what they had been moving toward. Something substantial. Something that looked like safety from the outside as well as the inside. What she saw instead was a modest settlement on a green-gray planet, low buildings spread across a shallow valley, the kind of place that had been built gradually and practically by people focused on function rather than appearance. No grand structures. No impressive skyline. Just a real place where real people were living. It was exactly right. She understood that immediately. The children did not need impressive. They needed real. Linda brought the margin call in slowly, the careful approach of a pilot who respects both her ship and whatever she's landing near. The communication with the colony's small docking authority was brief and warm in the way of communications between people who have been waiting for something good to happen and are now watching it happen. The colony knew they were coming. A message had gone ahead 3 days earlier, as soon as the Horan ship had turned away and the route had looked clear. They had been waiting. When the dock clamps engaged and the ship settled and the outer doors opened, there were people there. Vori adults, a dozen of them at least, standing on the dock in the pale morning light of this planet with its slightly different sun, and the sound they made when the first children appeared in the doorway was something Sarah had not heard in a long time. She didn't have a word for it in any language she'd learned. It was just a sound that meant you are here and we were so afraid you wouldn't be and now you are. The children went toward them without hesitation. That was the thing that stayed with Sarah. She had expected some caution, some of the careful approach behavior she had watched them practice for 9 days whenever something new presented itself. Instead they moved toward the adults on the dock with the full confidence of small beings who recognize something essential and do not need time to verify it. They knew these were their people. They went to them. Sarah stood in the doorway of the ship and watched this happen and felt 9 days of something very heavy begin to lift off her in pieces. The handoff took most of the day. There was a formal element to it, documents and registrations and the official recording of each child's presence and status, the kind of careful paperwork that exists to protect people by making them real in systems that might otherwise overlook them. Sarah moved through this methodically, answering questions, providing documentation, signing what needed signing. Linda's crew helped where they could, which was more than Sarah would have expected. Walt turning out to have a surprising competence with administrative systems and Deborah sitting with 3 of the children throughout the formal process, so they had a familiar face nearby during the parts that were confusing and slow. In between the official pieces there were other moments. A colony elder who took both of Sarah's hands in hers and held them for a moment without speaking, which in the Vori way of things was a complete statement requiring no addition. 2 of the older children who came to find Sarah specifically before they went with the colony families, not because they needed anything, just to stand near her for a moment the way they had been standing near her for 9 days and then to go. Ori, the youngest, who fell asleep during the afternoon proceedings and had to be carried, and who reached up while being carried and put one small hand against the face of the colony woman holding her and did not wake up. By early evening it was done. The children were placed. The documents were filed. The official part was over in the way that official parts end, not with a clear moment of conclusion but with a gradual trailing off, the last form signed, the last question answered, the last small logistical detail resolved, and then simply nothing left that required her. Sarah stood in the colony's small processing building after everyone else had moved on, and she took stock of herself in the particular way she had learned to take stock after significant things concluded. She checked her own condition the way she would check equipment. What was present, what was missing, what needed attention. What she found was this. She was tired in a way that went past the physical, past even the 9 days without proper sleep. A deeper tired, the kind that comes from carrying something at full tension for an extended period and then setting it down. Her hands felt strange without the weight. That was normal. She knew that was normal. She had debriefed herself after difficult assignments before and she recognized the particular disorientation of a purpose completed. What she did not recognize or had not recognized in this form before, was the other thing underneath it. The question that the tiredness had been covering and that was now visible with the tiredness moved aside. Not what next in the practical sense. She had functioned for long enough and was capable enough that what next in the practical sense was never really a crisis. But what next in the larger sense? What she was for, now, today, in a way that she chose rather than a way that was chosen by circumstance and duty. She went to find Linda. The upper deck of the margin call was a small observation area, more functional than scenic, a narrow platform above the main hull with a rail along the outer edge and a view of whatever the ship was near. Docked at the colony's small port it looked out over the settlement in the valley below, the low buildings lit from inside now as the evening came in, warm light in windows, the kind of glow that means people are home and the day is ending in ordinary ways. Linda was leaning against the rail with both forearms resting on it, looking out at the lights. She had a jacket on against the evening cool of the planet's air, which was coming in through the open upper section of the dock, real air, different from ship air, carrying the smell of the ground and the vegetation of this particular world. She heard Sarah come up behind her and looked over her shoulder briefly and then back at the lights below. She did not look surprised. She also did not look like someone who had been waiting and was now relieved that the waiting was over. She looked like someone who was simply where she was, which was, Sarah had come to understand over 9 days, one of Linda's most consistent qualities. She did not perform either presence or absence. She was just there or not there, and when she was there she was fully it. Sarah stood beside her at the rail. For a moment she also just looked at the colony lights in the valley. A child laughed somewhere down there, the sound carrying up in the still evening air, and Sarah recognized the voice as one of the older ones, one of the ones who had been most closed off for most of the 9 days, and the fact that she was laughing on the first evening meant something that Sarah felt rather than thought.
She said what she had come to say. She said it the way she said things, directly and without extra words, because that was how she communicated, and also because some things, if you add too many words to them, start to become less true rather than more. She said the children were settled. She said her duty, the specific one that had defined every hour of the past 9 days and most of her energy for longer than that, was complete. She said she had no direction after this that pulled harder than any other direction. Linda listened without interrupting. She had turned slightly towards Sarah while she spoke, not facing her fully but angled, the posture of someone giving their actual attention without making it formal. Then Sarah said the harder thing. She said that she had spent her life knowing what she was doing and why, and that the certainty of that had always been a kind of foundation, something solid under everything else. She said that in 9 days on the margin call something in that foundation had shifted, not broken, not undermined, but moved like a weight redistributed, settling into a different position that felt more honest than the previous one. She said it was because of what she had watched Linda do. Not the individual actions, not the paperwork or the heating unit or the 40 minutes on the comm, though all of those were part of it. It was the thing underneath those actions. The quality she had been trying to name since Kessler Station and had been circling around in the galley 4 nights ago and had not quite gotten to. The way Linda chose things. Not from duty and not from training, though she clearly had both. From something more direct than either of those. From a simple assessment of what was right and who was standing there and whether she was going to be that person or not. Sarah said she would like to understand that better. How a person lived like that. How it felt from the inside. She said she thought she might be better at understanding it from proximity than from a distance, and that the only way to have that proximity was to stay. She said all of this plainly, without making it smaller than it was, and without making it larger either. Just what it was, stated clearly, the way she had always believed important things deserved to be stated. Linda was quiet for a moment after she finished. She looked at Sarah with an expression that was not surprised and not calculating and not any of the things that Sarah had seen on other faces when she said significant things and watched people decide how to respond. It was just the expression of someone who had heard something true and was acknowledging that it was true. She said there was a bunk. If Sarah wanted it. Sarah said she wanted it. They stood at the rail for a little while longer after that, both of them looking at the lights of the colony in the valley below. The child who had laughed earlier laughed again, a different laugh, responding to something, and this time another voice laughed with her. The margin call left port the following morning just after sunrise, the planet's sun coming up at a slightly different angle than either of them were used to, painting the dock in a color that didn't have a precise name. Linda ran through the pre-departure checks with Deborah while Walt finished something in the engine room, and the rest of the crew moved through their morning routines. Sarah sat in the common area with a cup of the tea she had been drinking every evening since that first night in the galley, and she listened to the sounds of the ship preparing to move, and she felt, clearly and without ambiguity for the first time in longer than she could easily calculate, that she was somewhere she had chosen to be. Nobody made an announcement about the crew of 7. Nobody adjusted the formal documents beyond what was necessary for transit. Nobody sat down and had a conversation about what this was, or what it meant going forward. None of that was needed. The people on the margin call were practical people, and practical people understand that some things are simply true without requiring ceremony. The ship lifted. The colony dropped away below them, the valley and the warm lights and the low buildings getting smaller, and then gone. The planet curved away, and then the stars came in from all directions the way they always do when you leave atmosphere. All at once, the full width of everything open ahead. No destination filed yet. Just a heading, out into the lanes, into whatever came next. Linda's voice on the ship comm said they were clear and cruising, and that someone had made coffee if anyone wanted it. Sarah finished her tea, set the mug down, looked at the stars through the common area viewport. She had spent 9 days carrying 43 reasons to keep moving forward. The reasons were safe now. They were home, or the closest thing to home that existed for them right now, and they were going to be all right. She had one reason now. Her own. Chosen without duty and without instruction, just the simple, clear understanding that this was the direction she wanted to go. That was enough. More than enough. The margin call moved out into the stars, and the stars were very wide, and there was no particular rush, and they had, as it turned out, all the time they needed.